Trades and commerce. Visayans who practice trades like blacksmithing, boat building, or pot making are professionals in the sense of being compensated for specialized skills, but not necessarily in the sense of supporting themselves by their professions. Markets for their wares and services were limited. Traders, too, were full-time professionals, peddlers, and itinerant merchants, especially those who owned their own vessels, rented out cargo space, and traveled long distances from island to island, carrying goods in both directions.
Ironworking. Blacksmiths or panday, or more accurately, panday sa putaw, are workers in iron. To distinguish them from other craftsmen like goldsmiths, master carpenters, and boat builders, all of them were called panday. Smithing was considered the noblest profession, probably because only the wealthiest datus had the means to import the raw material. Iron itself had actually been produced in the Philippines in ancient times. Extracting the metal from ore by primitive methods is very difficult, and so is the transportation of the ore. Thus, it is generally more economical to trade local forest products for malleable cast iron if available. In the Visayas, those Chinese cauldrons remained the major source. They were deliberately broken up to supply local forges. This is how the bellows of the forge works and looks like. Bolo is the most important tool manufactured, repaired, or retempered. Woodworking. During the pre-colonial period in Visayas, men do their carpentry. Carpenters cut their own timber, carefully observing accepted nature lore in selecting it. The trees were cut with an axe and bolo, split down the middle with wedges, and each half adds into a single plank, squared with the same tool. All carpentry and house construction were done by skillful joinery with saws or nails. Boards were fitted together with mortise and tenons, joined end to end with scarf joints. Plates, bowls, spoons and ladles, urns, coffins and chests are hewn from a single block of wood. Rough leaves of the hagupit tree or biri palm were used as sandpaper or wood rasps, and the tough tail of the bissel ray fish of the daonan served to smooth even the hardest woods.
Architecture. The Visayan word for house is balay. There were three types: townhouses, cottages, and tree houses. Townhouses were occupied by datus. Cottages were occupied by ordinary people, and tree houses were only occupied in time of war. Houses were elevated off the ground and had steep roofs which were appropriate for a tropical environment characterized by heavy rains. Large townhouses were supported on tall hardwood pillars. The floor, salog, was divided into two sections. The grill and rattan ships were called buklak and were noisy enough to keep respectful house members off it while the datu was sleeping. The roof, atop, was made out of bamboo or palm leaf shingles. A ruling datu had the largest house in the community. Non-datus live in cottages, built of light materials ready to be moved every few years. Tree houses were occupied only in time of war, built either in actual trees 15 or more meters above the ground. If they were only for male warriors, they were simply reached by a vine. But if a whole family occupied them, they had a platform midway up, reached by a removable ladder, and a second ladder up to the house itself. Everything disappeared after Spanish pacification.
Boat building. Visayan boat builders preferred lawaan because it grew large enough for a baroto, 120 centimeters wide, to be hewn out of a single trunk. This is how most of the pre-colonial boats were made. In the Visayas, they call this baroto, while in Spain, they call it canwa, a dugout canoe.
Gold working. Gold is mentioned in early Spanish accounts more often than any other substance. Evidence shows not only of their interest in it, but of the fact that they found it everywhere they went. Spaniards seem to have never seen a Visayan without a gold on them, and said that all of them could tell where the gold came from just by looking at it. However, Visayans only went to get gold as needed. Juan Martinez stated, they would rather keep it below the ground than in cash boxes, because since they have wars, they can steal it from their house but not in the ground. Most of this mining was placer mining, gold panning in streams or riverbeds. Placers were called dulangan or dulong, the wooden pan used, the activity pamiling, meaning sifting, and a wooden trough or tub bilingan. Kotkot or kali was to mine by actual excavation. The Visayans called gold bulawan, and the fine gold himulawan, presumably from bulaw, meaning red or rosy, and a color they often produce artificially with porog, or ochre. Though they had touchstones or sanitran to test the gold's quality, most men could estimate its content on sight. The Visayans reckoned three different kinds of basing according to the quality of its gold content: labing siyam, worth 12 Spanish reals; labing walo, worth 10 or 11; and labing pito, only 9. Gold is a supremely workable metal, especially when pure, and Panday sa Bulawan took advantage of its properties in a number of ways. As Alcina said, one who knows how to make them today is hard to find. Alcina arrived in the Visayas in 1634, the time the number of local jewelers had increased but the quality of their goldwork had declined. Nevertheless, he had no doubts about the quality of ancient Visayan goldwork.
Weaving. The Visayan word for cloth, blanket, or skirt was habol, which was woven on a backstrap loom by women or male transvestites. The weaving process required a hardwood batten shaped like a dull sword as long as the fabric was wide. This equipment was sufficient for weaving plain or striped fabric, but to produce designs, additional cogon heddles were needed, and for fancy border strips which looked like embroidery. One or more pointed rods, like oversized knitting needles, were used to separate a few warp threads at a time. Weaving was a normal part of housekeeping, and women supplied all their menfolk's clothing. In epic literature, this is the pastime of even royal ladies and heroes departing on amorous adventures are ritually clothed with magical garments by their mothers or sisters. The Spaniards quickly demanded cotton as tribute for sailcloth or export to Mexico, and a year after, Legazpi seized Manila.
Domestic trade. The day after Magellan made his first Philippine landing on a Monahan island off the southern tip of Samar, some fishermen appeared from nearby Suluan to trade fish, coconuts, and arak. Initiated trade with unknown foreigners reflected a common feature of Visayan life. All communities exchanged foodstuffs. Few Visayan islands produced a surplus of rice, so it was traded for long distances. When Cebuanos tried to starve the Spaniards out, Muslim merchants supplied them with rice from Luzon and Panay. Coconuts were almost a cash crop. They were grown in plantations, shipped by boatloads or processed as oil, and tuba tappers ran to the trees or were hired to tend them. Salt derived from seawater was such an essential item of trade it served as a medium of exchange. One ganlang was a cake 5 to 6 meters square, worth a ganta of rice 3 liters. Thus, usa ka gantang of cloth about 80 centimeters was the length for which a weaver was paid such a piece of salt. Next to foodstuffs, the most common domestic trade goods were thread, cloth, and clothing. Spinning, weaving, and sewing were all women's work, sometimes for hire, and so was the marketing of their products. Clean abaca fibers and cotton thread were sold with a skein or bundle which could be encompassed by a thumb and forefinger, or komo. Pottery was also a female craft, from gathering the clay to padding the finished products, but whether they were distributed to other islands by merchants or the potters themselves is not clear. Rice was itself a medium of exchange. Pots were sold for the amount they could hold, and a gantang was the value of a ganta of unhusked rice. Expensive items like boats, slaves, or good hunting dogs were priced in gold tahil, or 38.4 grams. Calculations were made with little wooden counters or kukot, every tenth one being of different size. But there are no reports of pre-European coinage, even though the square-holed Chinese kas was in wide circulation in islands to the south.
Chinese enigma. The presence of Chinese trade goods in the 16th century Visayas is a well-attested fact, but the presence of the Chinese themselves is more problematic. Early Spanish explorers were told in Lianga Bay that Chinese junks came to Cebu and Mindanao every year. In Cebu, they were told that 8 survivors of the Magellan expedition had been sold to Chinese traders. In Sarangani, the Chinese traded in Cotabato, and in Abuyo, the Chinese traders actually resided in Sugod. The problem is that non-Chinese traders who sold Chinese goods were often called Chinese. The Visayans called foreign nations like the Borneans and Sanglayas Chinese or Sina. The word junk or junco of early Spanish accounts was actually Malay zhong, a ship of Southeast Asian build, not Chinese, whence Visayans adyong, a ship of high freeboard.
Hardware also came from Borneo, for example, small knives and spearheads and fine steel blades. The best creases and campilans came from Sangir, and Japanese swords also reached the Visayas to Manila. Sulu trade was reflected in a style of short jacket called sinulog. Whatever profit foreign merchants may have made on slaves and gold, the bulk of Visayan exports were forest and marine products: wax, civet, musk, ambergris, cinnamon, dyewood, and aromatic hardwood, dragon's blood, and red ants for coloring Chinese ink. In little emporia like Cebu, Filipino and foreign vessels registered, paid labor fees, and loaded merchandise which did not originate in Cebu. Pearls, coral, and tortoise shell came from islands to the south, while deer skins, antlers, and caged civet cats destined from Japan came from Mindanao, and so did caribou horns from China. Conversely, cheap cotton blankets were available from China. And as for Chinese jars that arrived in Manila, it was filled with wine or preserved fruits, which are widely resold empty.